There is a specific kind of cold that seeps into your bones when you are forced to sleep on the concrete floor of a windowless storage shed in the dead of winter. It's a biting, unforgiving chill that reminds you of everything you've lost. 34-year-old Sarah Jenkins had lost her father, her childhood home, and her life savings, all stripped away by a brother who manipulated a dying man's will. Homeless and betrayed, she had nowhere left to go but Unit 408. But as she huddled in the darkness, tracing the hollow-sounding metal panels at the back of the unit, Sarah had no idea she was sleeping inches away from a secret that would shatter her reality and deliver the ultimate revenge. The smell of lilies and old paper always reminds Sarah of the week her life fell apart. Her father, Thomas Jenkins, had been a fixture in Seattle's Pioneer Square antique district for 4 decades. He was a master restorer, a man who could look at a splintered Victorian armoire and see the soul beneath the rot. But his heart had been failing for years, and it was Sarah who had stepped in. She abandoned her own career in graphic design at 26 to run the shop, manage his doctor's appointments, and cook his low-sodium meals. She was the one holding his hand when the heart monitor flatlined on a rainy Tuesday in November. Her older brother, David, was not there. David was a private equity manager in Chicago, a man who measured life in quarterly earnings and profit margins. He hadn't visited Seattle in 3 years, claiming the airfare and time away from his firm were too costly. Yet, within 24 hours of their father's death, David's sleek silver Mercedes rental pulled into the driveway of the family home in Queen Anne. He wore a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit to the funeral, shook the right hands, and dabbed his eyes with practiced precision. The real shock didn't come from the grief. It came 3 days later in the mahogany-paneled office of Richard Sterling, an estate lawyer David had somehow procured within hours of his arrival. "I know this is a difficult time for both of you," Sterling began, his voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He slid a thick, bound document across the desk. "But we must attend to your father's estate. As you know, Thomas updated his will shortly before his passing." Sarah frowned, her eyes darting between the lawyer and her brother. "Updated? Dad hasn't been to a lawyer in 15 years. His will left the house and the shop to both of us evenly. We discussed it." David leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Actually, Sarah, Dad and I had a long talk when I flew in for that weekend in August. He was worried about the business. Worried about you. Really. He felt you lacked the commercial instincts to keep the estate profitable. He was on heavy doses of morphine in August," Sarah snapped, her voice trembling. "He barely knew what day it was." "The document is perfectly legal," Sterling intervened smoothly, notarized and witnessed. "According to this revised will, the entire estate, the Queen Anne property, the Pioneer Square storefront, and all liquid assets are left to David. He has been named sole executor." The room spun. Sarah gripped the armrests of her chair, trying to ground herself. "And me?" Sterling flipped to the last page. "To his daughter, Sarah, he leaves the sum of $5,000 and the contents of a rented storage unit. I have the key right here." The lawyer pushed a small brass key across the desk. Attached to it was a faded yellow paper tag that simply read, PC 408. $5,000? Sarah whispered. "I co-signed the loans for his experimental treatments last year. I owe nearly $40,000 to Swedish Medical Center. The house alone is worth $2 million. David sighed, a sound of profound, manufactured exhaustion. "Sarah, be reasonable. You've been living rent-free at the house for years. Dad was practically supporting you. I was his full-time caretaker," she screamed, finally losing her composure. "I gave up my life for him. You stole this, David. You had him sign a piece of paper when he was hallucinating from the pain medication. If you want to contest it in court, you are welcome to try," David replied, his tone turning to ice. "But probate takes years, and my legal team will bury you in motions until you're bankrupt. Speaking of which, I've already accepted a cash offer from a developer for the house. You have until Friday to clear out your room." In a matter of 45 minutes, Sarah's entire existence was erased. The law, it turned out, cared very little for fairness or loyalty. It cared only for signatures. She sought the advice of 2 different legal aid attorneys, but both told her the same devastating truth. Proving undue influence on a deceased person was incredibly difficult and breathtakingly expensive. She had no money to fight. By Friday afternoon, she was standing on the curb with 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes containing her entire life. She watched the locksmith change the locks on her childhood home. David didn't even show up to say goodbye. He sent an assistant to oversee the eviction. Sarah checked her bank account on her phone. After paying the first installment on the medical debt to keep the creditors from garnishing what little she had, her balance sat at a dismal $412. Seattle is a merciless city to be broke in. A studio apartment required first, last, and a security deposit she didn't possess. The shelters were full, and the waiting lists for subsidized housing were years long. She spent her first weekend sleeping in the back of her rusted 2008 Honda Civic, parking under the pale orange glow of a streetlight in an industrial park in Everett, terrified of every shadow that passed by the window. On Monday morning, her car wouldn't start. The alternator had finally given out. A tow truck driver offered her $200 for it as scrap. Desperate, she took the cash. Standing in the freezing drizzle, holding her suitcases, Sarah remembered the small brass key buried in the pocket of her coat. PC 408. It was the only thing in the world she officially owned. Pine Creek Self-Storage sat on a desolate stretch of highway 40 minutes north of the city. It was a sprawling, neglected facility surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. The asphalt driveways were cracked, and the faded orange paint on the corrugated metal buildings was peeling away in long, sad strips. Sarah walked into the front office, dragging her suitcases over the threshold. The room smelled of stale coffee and stale cigarette smoke. Behind the counter sat a heavy-set man in his 60s, watching a muted television screen. His name tag read Bill. "Can I help you?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the screen. Sarah pulled the brass key from her pocket and placed it on the counter. "I think my father rented a unit here. Thomas Jenkins. Unit 408. Bill slowly turned his attention to his ancient desktop computer, his thick fingers pecking at the keyboard. Jenkins. Nope. No Thomas Jenkins. Panic seized her chest. "Are you sure? The lawyer gave me this key. He said it was in the will." Bill took the key, adjusting his reading glasses to look at the faded yellow tag. PC 408. "Well, that's one of the large exterior units in Building C. Let me search by the unit number." He tapped a few more keys. "Ah, here it is. It's not under Jenkins. It's under Tom Jenks's." Sarah blinked. Tom Jenks? Her father was a stickler for details. Why would he use a fake name? "Account is paid in full," Bill continued, scratching his chin. "Paid up for the next 8 years, actually. Guy came in 3 years ago, dropped a cashier's check for a 10-year lease. Said he didn't want the hassle of monthly billing. 3 years ago. That was right around the time her father had received his initial heart diagnosis." "Can I access it now?" Sarah asked. "Sure. Building C is all the way in the back. Just remember, facility closes at 9 p.m. Gates lock automatically. Anyone caught inside after that gets a trespass warning, and I call the cops." Sarah nodded, though a desperate plan was already forming in her mind. She hauled her bags through the maze of metal buildings. The sky was turning the color of a bruised plum, the winter sun dipping below the tree line. She found Building C, a long row of oversized units, designed for RVs and boats. She stopped in front of the roll-up door marked 408. Her hands were shaking as she slid the key into the heavy padlock. It turned with a satisfying click. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the handle and threw her weight into lifting the metal door. It shrieked in protest, rolling upward to reveal the cavernous interior. Sarah reached in and pulled the hanging string for the overhead light. A single, bare bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. The unit was completely empty. There were no antique dressers, no hidden family heirlooms, no boxes of old photographs. It was just 20 by 30 feet of cold, sweeping concrete. surrounded by cheap aluminum walls. Sarah dropped to her knees, the sheer weight of her exhaustion and grief finally crushing her. She let out a sob that echoed off the metal walls. Her father had left her a decade-long lease on a box of air. This was her grand inheritance, a monument to her failure to protect herself from her brother's greed. But as the temperature dropped, survival instinct took over. The outside air was nearing freezing. She had $612 to her name. She had no car, no home, and nowhere else to be. Sarah closed the heavy metal door, pulling it down from the inside until it latched securely. She was officially a resident of Unit 408. The first few weeks were a lesson in urban survival. Living in a storage shed is an exercise in extreme paranoia. She learned the patrol patterns of Bill and the night security guard. She had to enter her unit before the 9 p.m. lockdown, quietly pulling the door shut so it looked locked from the outside. She bought a heavy-duty Sub-Zero sleeping bag from a thrift store. Unrolling it on a layer of cardboard she scavenged from a nearby grocery store to insulate herself from the freezing concrete. For the bathroom, she used a bucket lined with trash bags at night, and during the day, she walked a mile to a local fast food restaurant to wash her face in the sink and use their facilities. She lived on peanut butter, stale bread, and canned soup eaten cold directly from the tin. The psychological toll was immense. Lying in the pitch black of the shed, listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof, Sarah thought about David. She imagined him in their father's house, drinking expensive scotch, laughing with his finance friends. The injustice of it burned in her chest, a hot ember that kept her going when the cold threatened to break her. It was mid-February, during a particularly violent windstorm, that her life changed forever. The power to the facility had been knocked out. Sarah was huddled in her sleeping bag, reading a library book by the beam of a small LED flashlight. She accidentally knocked the flashlight off her cardboard mat. It rolled across the slightly sloped concrete floor, traveling toward the very back of the deep unit. Sarah sighed, unzipping her sleeping bag, and crawled across the freezing floor to retrieve it. The flashlight had come to rest, flush against the back corrugated wall. As she picked it up, she lost her balance slightly, and her knee struck the metal paneling. Thud. Sarah paused. She tapped the metal wall beside her. Clang. A high, thin, metallic sound. The sound of a thin, aluminum sheet with nothing behind it. She moved a foot to the right, exactly where her knee had hit, and tapped again with her knuckles. Thud. It was a heavy, dense sound, dull, like hitting solid wood or thick steel. Frowning, she swept the flashlight beam over the back wall. To the naked eye, it looked exactly like the side wall's standard, vertical ridges of cheap sheet metal secured by hex bolts. But looking closely at the bottom edge, she noticed a faint, unnatural line of gray industrial caulking. Her heart began to race. Her father was a master at concealment. He spent his life building secret compartments into antique desks, false bottoms into steamer trunks. People only look at the surface, Sarah. He used to tell her while sanding down a mahogany bureau. If you make the surface boring enough, they'll never look behind it. Sarah scrambled back to her bags and dug out a multi-tool she had bought for $5 at a pawn shop. She hurried back to the anomalous section of the wall. Using the pliers on the tool, she clamped onto one of the hex bolts, securing the metal panel to the framing. It was tight. She gritted her teeth, putting all her upper body weight into the twist. With a sharp crack, the bolt gave way. She quickly removed it, then moved to the next. There were 6 bolts in total, securing a 4-foot-wide section of the paneling. Her hands were bleeding and blistered by the time the last bolt hit the concrete. Sarah grabbed the edge of the corrugated metal sheet and pulled. It was surprisingly light. The panel peeled away from the wall, screeching loudly. She shoved it aside, raising her flashlight to illuminate the space she had just uncovered. Her breath caught in her throat. Behind the flimsy aluminum wall was not the cinder block exterior of the building. It was a massive, 6-inch thick steel door, painted matte black. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault, complete with a heavy steel wheel in the center and a digital keypad mounted to the right. In the center of the door, Etched faintly into the steel were 3 letters: S.A.J. Sarah Ann Jenkins. Her father hadn't left her an empty room. He had left her a fortress, and whatever was inside it was meant specifically for her. The red LED light of the keypad blinked steadily in the dim, freezing air of Unit 408. Sarah's bruised, bloody fingers hovered over the plastic buttons. She was staring at a 6-digit lock that stood between her and whatever final message her father had left behind. She pulled her thrift store sleeping bag around her shoulders, her breath pluming in white clouds, and tried to think. Thomas Jenkins was a man of deliberate action. He never left anything to chance, and he certainly wouldn't use a generic code. She tried her birthday, 112489. The keypad emitted a harsh, flat beep, and the LED flashed red. She tried her father's birthday, red flash. She tried the date her mother had passed away, red flash. 3 strikes, Sarah muttered to herself. Most high-security vaults triggered a lockout after 5 consecutive failed attempts. She pulled her hand back, terrified of permanently sealing the door. She closed her eyes and visualized her father in his workshop on Yesler Way, sawdust coating his apron, meticulously reassembling the gears of an 18th-century French mantel clock. "People are predictable, Sarah," he had told her once, adjusting a magnifying loupe over his right eye. "They use dates because they fear forgetting. But a restorer doesn't remember dates. A restorer remembers the work." The work. What was the most significant piece of work they had ever completed together? When Sarah was 19, just before she left for design school, her father had acquired a completely shattered 1927 Steinway Model D concert grand piano. It had been in a fire at a historic theater in Tacoma. The soundboard was cracked, the ivory keys melted, the mahogany case charred. It took them 18 months to bring it back to life. They worked late into the night, side by side, sanding, restringing, and polishing until the wood gleamed like liquid fire. When they finally sold it to a private collector in Vienna, the shipping manifest bore a specific 6-digit customs inventory number. Her father had framed that shipping receipt. It hung directly above his workbench until the day he died. She could still see the black ink on the faded yellow paper. Trembling, Sarah reached out and pressed the numbers. 802416. The keypad went dark for an agonizing second. Then, a sharp mechanical clack echoed through the shed, followed by a soft whirring sound. A green light illuminated the keypad. Sarah grabbed the heavy steel wheel in the center of the door and hauled it to the left. The hinges, perfectly oiled and balanced, swung the massive 6-inch thick steel door outward with zero resistance. Warm, dry air spilled out from the darkness inside, carrying the faint, familiar scent of cedarwood, beeswax, and old paper. Sarah reached blindly around the inner doorframe until she found a switch. She flicked it, and an array of warm LED strip lights flickered to life, revealing a space roughly 8 feet deep and 10 feet wide, a room built entirely within the shell of the larger unit. The walls of the vault were lined with thick, white foam insulation. In the corner sat a heavy-duty industrial dehumidifier, quietly humming away, powered by a massive stack of deep-cycle marine batteries connected to what looked like a trickle-charging inverter system. But it was the center of the room that brought Sarah to her knees. Stacked precisely on wooden pallets were 6 black, military-grade Pelican transit cases. Next to them sat a vintage, fireproof Mosler safe. Resting on top of the safe was a single, sealed, manila envelope. Across the front, written in her father's elegant, sweeping calligraphy, were 2 words: for Sarah. She crawled into the vault, the sudden warmth causing her freezing skin to prickle, and tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter written on the heavy cotton rag paper her father favored. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means my heart has finally given out, and David has shown you exactly who he is. I am so deeply sorry that I could not protect you from him in the light of day, but I had to ensure he believed he had won. 4 years ago, I discovered that your brother had committed massive securities fraud at his private equity firm in Chicago. To cover a catastrophic margin call, he forged my signature and leveraged a $3 million line of credit against the Queen Anne house and the antique shop. I found the bank notices hidden in his old room when he visited. I confronted him. He wept. He begged. He told me he would go to federal prison if I reported the fraud or defaulted on the loan. As a father, my greatest weakness was refusing to destroy my own son, no matter how corrupted he had become. So, I paid it. I quietly assumed the debt to keep him out of a cell. But I knew then that David was completely devoid of a moral compass. I knew that when I died, he would descend upon the estate like a vulture and take everything from you to feed his endless greed. He thought my business was failing because the shop's ledgers showed dwindling cash reserves. He didn't know that for the last 4 years, I have been quietly liquidating the most valuable, off-the-books antiquities in my private collection to a network of international buyers. I converted the cash into assets that probate lawyers and greedy brothers cannot track. The estate David is inheriting is a hollow shell, heavily mortgaged and drowning in hidden liabilities. I structured specifically to collapse on him. He thinks he has inherited a fortune. He has inherited a financial time bomb. The contents of this vault belong to you. You are my true legacy, Sarah. Use this to rebuild. Use this to take back what is yours. And when the time comes, do not show your brother the mercy I so foolishly did. With all my love, Dad. Tears streamed down Sarah's unwashed face, leaving clean tracks in the grime. She wasn't discarded. She wasn't forgotten. Her father had spent the last years of his painful, failing life building a fortress for her. She wiped her eyes and unlatched the heavy clasps of the first Pelican case. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were neat, shrink-wrapped stacks of paper. Sarah pulled a bundle out. They were municipal bearer bonds from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Unlike modern digital stocks, bearer bonds are entirely unregistered. Whoever physically holds the paper owns the debt and can collect the principal and the tax-free interest. There were millions of dollars here, perfectly legal, completely untraceable, and ready to be cashed out. She opened the second case. It was heavy, almost too heavy to lift. It was packed with rows of hard plastic slabs. Sarah recognized them immediately, PCGS-graded coin holders. She pulled out a slab. Encased in the plastic was a gleaming gold coin. The label read, 1,907 St. Gordon's Double Eagle High Relief Wire Rim, grade MS-65. Sarah gasped. Even with her rusty knowledge of numismatics, she knew a single one of these coins at that grade could easily fetch $150,000 to $200,000 at auction. There were at least 40 slabs in this case alone. She went through the remaining cases, finding bundles of consecutive, serial number, $100 bills, Swiss bank depository receipts, and a ledger detailing exactly how to contact the private brokers her father had used. Sitting cross-legged on the floor of the vault, surrounded by an estimated $8 million in liquid wealth, Sarah Jenkins looked down at her torn, dirty jeans and the bruised hands that had been digging through garbage cans for discarded bread just 3 days prior. The grief and the terror that had choked her for months evaporated, replaced by something entirely new. It was a cold, absolute clarity. David had wanted to leave her with nothing. He was about to find out what a woman with nothing left to lose could do when handed a sword. Surviving sudden wealth requires infinitely more discipline than surviving sudden poverty. Sarah knew that if a homeless woman walked into a Bank of America branch in downtown Seattle trying to cash a $100,000 municipal bearer bond, the police would be called before she even reached the teller. She needed to launder herself first. She spent one final night on the concrete floor, not out of necessity, but as a promise to never forget the cold. At 6 a.m., she opened one of the Pelican cases and extracted 2 ungraded, raw, $20 Liberty Head gold coins. They were essentially bullion valuable for their weight, not their rarity worth about $2,000 each. She slipped them into her pocket, locked the massive steel vault door, and secured the outer aluminum panel back in place with the hex bolts. To the naked eye, Unit 408 was just a slightly battered, empty storage shed. She walked 2 miles to a bus stop, took the transit into downtown Seattle, and waited outside a pawn shop in Belltown until the neon open sign buzzed to life at 9 a.m. The pawnbroker, a cynical man behind thick, bulletproof glass, eyed her disheveled appearance suspiciously. When she slid the first gold coin into the metal transfer tray, his eyebrows shot up. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "Inheritance," Sarah lied smoothly, keeping her voice flat. "I need cash today. I know the spot price of gold is sitting at $2,040 an ounce. This is nearly a full ounce. I'll take $1,800. The broker squinted through his loupe. He knew she was desperate, but he also knew a guaranteed profit when he saw one. He tested it with an electronic gold reader. It beeped green. He didn't ask any more questions. 10 minutes later, Sarah walked out into the Seattle drizzle with 36 $50 bills in her pocket. Her first stop was a local gym, where she paid $20 for a day pass just to use the showers. She stood under the scalding water for nearly an hour, washing away the grime of the storage facility. From there, she went to Nordstrom Rack. She didn't buy anything flashy, just high-quality basics. A tailored black wool coat, dark jeans, a cashmere sweater, and a pair of leather boots. She bought a secure, anti-theft travel backpack and a prepaid AT&T smartphone. By 2 p.m., she was checking into a suite at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel under the name Sarah Adams, paying for a week in advance with a prepaid Visa card she had loaded at a pharmacy. Sitting on the edge of the plush, king-size bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of luxury, she booted up her new phone and pulled out her father's leather-bound ledger. She found the name she was looking for under the contact list for Portland, Oregon: Silas Croft, numismatist and estate liquidator. Highly discreet. The next morning, she boarded the Amtrak Cascades train heading south. She carried 5 of the graded 1,907 Double Eagles in her backpack. Silas Croft operated out of a beautifully restored, unmarked brick building in Portland's Pearl District. The security was intense. Sarah had to be buzzed through 2 sets of reinforced doors before entering an office that looked more like a 19th century gentleman's library than a financial institution. Croft was a man in his late 70s, impeccably dressed in a tweed 3-piece suit with shrewd, piercing gray eyes. He poured 2 cups of Earl Grey tea before even asking why she was there. "Your father was a master, Miss Jenkins," Croft said softly, examining one of the slabs she had placed on his mahogany desk. He possessed an eye for restoration that bordered on the supernatural. I was deeply saddened to hear of his passing. He told me he was putting away a nest egg. I see now he was building a dragon's hoard. "My brother took the public estate, Mr. Croft," Sarah said, sipping her tea. Her posture was perfect, her tone entirely devoid of emotion. "My father left this for me, hidden away. I need to liquidate the contents of the vault, safely, legally, and entirely off the grid. If my brother's estate lawyers catch wind of this capital, they will attempt to drag it into probate." Croft nodded slowly, placing the coin down. "You have bearer bonds as well, I presume?" "Millions," Sarah confirmed. "But cashing them stateside is a vulnerability. Indeed, American banks have become terribly nosy since 2001. Croft chuckled dryly. "Here is how we handle this. I have partners in Geneva and Singapore. We will establish a blind trust in the Cayman Islands. You will act as the sole beneficiary, but on paper, the trust is managed by an independent Swiss firm. We will physically transport the coins and bonds via a secure, insured courier Brinks Global Services to Switzerland. The bonds will be cashed through the trust, and the rare coins will be sold quietly at private auctions in Europe to collectors who value discretion over public prestige." "And the fees?" Sarah asked. 10% of the gross," Croft replied without blinking. "For that, you get absolute invisibility. The funds will be routed back to the United States into a Delaware LLC. From there, you can draw a salary, buy property, or fund whatever endeavors you have planned, and your name will never appear on a single public registry." "Done," Sarah said, extending her hand. Over the next 4 weeks, Sarah Jenkins officially ceased to exist as a vulnerable entity. She became the managing director of Aegis Holdings LLC. The physical transfer of the vault's contents took 3 agonizing days, during which Sarah watched armed guards load her father's legacy into armored trucks. By the end of the month, the first wave of European auctions concluded, and the bearer bonds were processed. Sarah logged into her new, heavily encrypted banking portal on a brand new MacBook Pro. The account balance glowed back at her, $8,412,500. She was sitting in a high-rise, short-term rental apartment overlooking the Seattle waterfront. The city glittered below her, completely unaware of the shift in power that had just occurred. She opened a second tab on her browser and typed in the name of her brother's firm, Meridian Equity Partners. David's face smiled back at her from the company's leadership page. He looked smug, wealthy, and entirely secure. A recent press release on the site boasted about a new, highly leveraged commercial real estate acquisition. Meridian was launching in Chicago. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had acquired from a high-end corporate fixer Croft had recommended. Vanguard Investigative Services, a sharp, professional voice answered. "This is Miller." "Mr. Miller, my name is Sarah," she said, her voice like cut glass. "I need a forensic accounting team. I want a complete, microscopic audit of a private equity manager named David Jenkins and his firm, Meridian Equity. I want to know about his margin calls, his offshore shell companies, his hidden debts, and his weaknesses. I want to know who he owes money to and who he fears." "That kind of deep dive is expensive, ma'am," Miller warned. "We charge a retainer of $50,000 just to open the file." Sarah smiled, looking out at the cold, dark waters of the Puget Sound. "Wire transfer is fine. Let me know where to send it. I want him dismantled, Mr. Miller, brick by brick." The dossier from Vanguard Investigative Services arrived via a secure, encrypted Proton mail link exactly 14 days later. Sarah sat at the marble island of her rented penthouse, a cup of black coffee steaming beside her, and opened the PDF. It was 92 pages long, meticulously detailing the financial anatomy of David Jenkins. Mr. Miller had not exaggerated his firm's capabilities. The report was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, pulling back the curtain on Meridian Equity Partners to reveal a staggering house of cards. David was a man addicted to the appearance of immense wealth, but his actual liquidity was practically zero. His firm specialized in highly leveraged buyouts of distressed commercial real estate. Currently, his crown jewel was a partially completed luxury condominium tower on Wacker Drive in Chicago, but the project was hemorrhaging capital due to supply chain delays and labor disputes. To keep the construction afloat and appease his early investors, David had taken out a massive, high-interest mezzanine loan from a shadow banking syndicate based in New York. More importantly, Miller had tracked down the exact nature of the debt tied to the Seattle estate. When David committed securities fraud 4 years ago, their father had quietly assumed a $3.5 million liability to keep David out of federal prison. The father had collateralized the Queen Anne home and the Pioneer Square antique shop to secure a commercial line of credit from Pacific Northwest Bank. David, as the new executor and sole beneficiary of the estate, had inherited those properties. He believed they were cash cows he could quickly liquidate to save his Chicago tower. He had already listed the Queen Anne home with a luxury real estate broker for $8 million, and was aggressively shopping the Pioneer Square storefront to commercial developers. But David was arrogant. He hadn't read the fine print of the commercial loan their father had signed. Sarah flipped to page 47 of the dossier. There it was, a change of control covenant. The clause stipulated that, if the original guarantor, Thomas Jenkins, died, the bank had the right to call the entire $3.5 million loan due immediately, rather than letting it ride on its current 10-year amortization schedule. Pacific Northwest Bank simply hadn't noticed Thomas Jenkins's passing yet, as the monthly minimum payments were still being automatically drawn from a dwindling estate checking account. Sarah smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression. She needed a lawyer, not a polite estate planner like Richard Sterling, but a corporate apex predator. Through Silas Croft's network, she was introduced to Harrison Gable, a senior partner at a ruthless litigation firm occupying the 68th floor of the Columbia Center in downtown Seattle. Gable was a man whose suits cost more than Sarah's old Honda Civic, and he billed at $1,200 an hour. Sarah walked into his corner office wearing her new tailored coat, carrying a briefcase containing the Vanguard dossier and a verified statement from her offshore trust, showing a cash balance north of $8 million. "I don't want to sue my brother, Mr. Gable," Sarah said, taking a seat across from his massive glass desk. "Lawsuits take years. I want to buy his debt, trigger a default, and force him to surrender his assets to me before he even knows he's bleeding." Gable adjusted his silk tie, his eyes scanning the summary page of her financials. "Hostile debt acquisition. It's aggressive, Miss Jenkins, and expensive." "I have the capital," Sarah replied smoothly. "I want Aegis Holdings, LLC, to purchase the $3.5 million commercial note from Pacific Northwest Bank. Banks hate risk, especially on commercial paper tied to a deceased guarantor. Offer them a 5% premium on the principal to sell the note to us quietly. Once Aegis owns the paper, we are my brother's new bank." Gable leaned forward, a genuine spark of professional admiration in his eyes. "And once we hold the paper, we notify Mr. Jenkins of the change of control covenant. We demand the $3.5 million in full within 30 days, or we foreclose on the Queen Anne house and the Pioneer Square shop." "Exactly," Sarah said. "But my brother doesn't have $3.5 million. His Chicago project is draining him dry. He will panic. He will try to negotiate a settlement. At which point," Gable concluded, picking up his gold Montblanc pen, "Aegis Holdings will graciously offer to accept the deeds to the Seattle properties in lieu of foreclosure, wiping out his debt, but leaving him with absolutely no capital to save his Chicago tower." "Dismantled brick by brick," Sarah whispered. "Draft the acquisition offer, Mr. Gable. Let's go shopping." For the next 3 weeks, Sarah lived in a state of hyper-focused adrenaline. She authorized a wire transfer of $3.67 million from her Cayman Trust to Gable's escrow account. The corporate buyout of the banknote went smoothly. Pacific Northwest Bank was thrilled to offload a potentially messy probate asset for an immediate cash profit. On a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after Sarah had been evicted and forced into a freezing storage shed, the King County Recorder's Office officially registered Aegis Holdings, LLC as the primary lien holder on the estate of Thomas Jenkins. The trap was set. Now, it was time to spring it. David Jenkins was sweating through his bespoke shirt. He sat in his corner office in the Loop District of Chicago, staring at a flashing red light on his multi-line phone. It was his lead contractor on the Wacker Drive Tower. They were threatening to walk off the job at noon if a $1.2 million invoice for structural steel wasn't paid. "Just stall them," David barked at his assistant through the intercom. "Tell them the wire is clearing international compliance." It was a lie. There was no wire. Meridian Equity Partners had $41,000 left in operating capital. His personal accounts were maxed. The only lifeline he had was the impending sale of his dead father's house in Seattle. The buyer, a tech executive, was supposed to close in 10 days. It would inject a desperately needed $2 million into his accounts, enough to pay the contractors and keep the New York mezzanine lenders at bay for another quarter. His cell phone vibrated on the desk. It was an unrecognized Seattle number. Hoping it was the real estate broker with an update on the closing, David snatched it up. "David Jenkins?" he answered brusquely. "Mr. Jenkins, my name is Harrison Gable. I am the legal counsel representing Aegis Holdings, LLC. David frowned, rubbing his temples. "I don't know who that is. If you're pitching private equity services, I'm not interested." "We aren't pitching a service, Mr. Jenkins. We are calling to inform you of a change in your creditor status. As of yesterday, Aegis Holdings has purchased the promissory note and all associated collateral instruments originally held by Pacific Northwest Bank against the estate of Thomas Jenkins. The blood drained from David's face. The room suddenly felt very cold. What? Why would a bank sell a performing loan? Because your father passed away, Mr. Jenkins, Gable said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. According to Section 4, Paragraph B of the Master Loan Agreement, the death of the primary guarantor constitutes a material change of control. The bank had the right to accelerate the loan. They chose to sell that right to my client. David gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. Listen to me, Gable. The estate is solvent. The Queen Anne property goes into escrow next week. You'll get your monthly payments. We don't want monthly payments, Mr. Jenkins, Gable countered smoothly. My client is exercising the acceleration clause. The entire principal balance of $3.5 million, plus accrued interest, is due in full. You have 14 days to remit payment via wire transfer, or Aegis Holdings will file an immediate notice of default and initiate foreclosure proceedings on both the Queen Anne residence and the Pioneer Square commercial property. 14 days? David shouted, leaping to his feet. Are you insane? I can't liquidate $3.5 million in 14 days. I have a buyer for the house, but the title company won't clear it if there's an active foreclosure action. That sounds like a liquidity issue on your end, sir. If you fail to cure the debt, we will seize the properties. Furthermore, since the collateral falls short of the total debt, we will file a deficiency judgment against you personally as the executor and beneficiary. Have a pleasant afternoon. The line clicked dead. David dropped the phone. The walls of his luxurious office seemed to be closing in. A deficiency judgment would trigger a cross default on his mezzanine loan in New York. If that happened, his investors would demand an immediate audit. They would see the empty accounts. The SEC would be called. He wouldn't just be bankrupt, he would be indicted. Over the next 12 days, David descended into absolute panic. He called every favor he had in Chicago, begging for short-term bridge loans. He was universally rejected. The financial world smells desperation like blood in the water. He tried to stall Gable, offering increased interest rates, but the lawyer was an impenetrable wall of ice. On day 13, broken and exhausted, David flew to Seattle. He walked into the Columbia Center and took the elevator to Harrison Gable's office. He looked a decade older than he had at his father's funeral. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly as he sat across from the high-powered attorney. I don't have the cash, David rasped, staring at the polished wood of Gable's desk. The Wacker Drive project is frozen. If you foreclose and file a judgment, you force me into Chapter 11. You'll be tied up in bankruptcy court for 5 years fighting my other creditors. You'll get pennies? Gable steepled his fingers, watching David with the detached interest of a biologist observing a dying insect. My client is aware of your precarious financial position, Mr. Jenkins. We have no desire to navigate federal bankruptcy court. Therefore, my client has authorized a final settlement offer. Gable slid a thick, blue-backed legal document across the desk. A deed in lieu of foreclosure, Gable explained. You will sign over the title to the Queen Anne property and the Pioneer Square commercial building directly to Aegis Holdings LLC. Today, you waive all rights to contest. In exchange, my client will forgive the entirety of the $3.5 million debt and waive the right to seek any further damages. You walk away with nothing from the estate, but you walk away free and clear. David stared at the document. It was a complete surrender. His father's entire legacy, gone. He had stolen it from his sister, manipulated his dying father, and now he was handing it over to a faceless corporation just to save his own skin. But he had no choice. If he fought, he went to prison. He picked up the pen Gable offered him. His hand shook so badly he could barely form the letters, but he signed his name on the designated lines. The notary present stamped the pages with a loud, final thud. It's done, David whispered, his voice cracking. Who are they? Who is the principal behind Aegis? Gable gathered the documents, tapping them against the desk to align the edges. He looked past David, toward the heavy oak doors of the office. She can answer that herself. The doors opened. Sarah walked into the room, She was wearing a charcoal gray suit that radiated quiet authority, her hair pulled back, her posture impeccable. She looked nothing like the broken, grieving girl David had thrown onto the street months ago. David froze. His eyes darted from Sarah to Gable, then back to Sarah. His mind struggled to process the impossibility of the scene. Sarah? What are you doing here? Sarah walked slowly to the desk and picked up the signed deeds. She looked at her brother's signature, running her thumb over the blue ink. "Hello, David," she said, her voice perfectly calm, lacking any of the rage he had expected. "I'm the managing director of Aegis Holdings. Thank you for returning my house." The silence in Harrison Gable's office was absolute, save for the faint, rhythmic ticking of a vintage brass clock on the bookshelf. David Jenkins stared at his sister, his mouth slightly open, the color completely drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a curb and realized, a fraction of a second too late, that a freight train was bearing down on him. "Sarah?" he finally choked out, the syllable scratching against his dry throat. "This Aegis Holdings. It's you? That's impossible. You were bankrupt. You were living in your car." "I was living in Unit 408 at Pine Creek Self-Storage. Actually," Sarah corrected, her voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. She walked past him and sat in the leather chair previously occupied by Gable, who had quietly stepped back to lean against the mahogany wall, watching the execution unfold with professional detachment. "You left me to freeze, David. You gave me $5,000 and a padlock key, while you stepped into a custom Tom Ford suit and tried to sell our father's life to the highest bidder." David's hands were shaking violently now. "Where did you get $3.5 million? The estate accounts were drained. Dad was broke." Sarah reached into her tailored blazer and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cotton rag paper. It was a photocopy of the letter their father had left in the vault. She slid it across the glass desk toward him. "Dad wasn't broke," Sarah said softly. "Dad was hiding. He knew about the margin call in Chicago 4 years ago, David. He knew you forged his signature to leverage the Queen Anne house and the shop. He paid the debt to keep his only son out of federal prison." David's eyes scanned the letter. His breath hitched. The carefully constructed facade he had maintained for years, the image of the brilliant, self-made private equity titan, shattered into a million jagged pieces on the floor of the Columbia Center. "He knew you were a parasite," Sarah continued, leaning forward. "So he spent the last years of his life liquidating the true value of his private collection. He converted it into untraceable assets and locked them in a steel vault built into the walls of that storage shed. He left the heavily mortgaged, toxic shell of his public estate for you to inherit, knowing your own greed would blind you to the trap. You set me up," David whispered, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over his eyelashes. "You bought the debt just to crush me. You knew the Wacker Drive project was failing." "I merely accelerated the inevitable," Sarah replied. "You signed the deeds, David. The Seattle properties belong to Aegis Holdings. Your debt here is forgiven. You are free to go back to Chicago and deal with your mess." David let out a hysterical, breathless laugh, wiping his face. "You think you've won? Fine. You have the house, you have the shop, but I'm out from under the Pacific Northwest Bank loan. I don't have the cash from the house sale, but I'm no longer in default here. I can still restructure the mezzanine debt in New York. I can still save my firm." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. She stood up, buttoning her blazer. "You really don't understand how this level of the game is played, do you?" she asked. "Mr. Gable?" Harrison Gable stepped forward, adjusting his cuffs. "Mr. Jenkins, while it is true that your debt to Aegis Holdings is settled, commercial financial markets rely heavily on transparency. When Aegis purchased your distressed debt, my firm was legally obligated to file a public notice of the transfer. Furthermore, when we issued the notice of default yesterday to force this meeting, it became a matter of public record." David froze, his eyes darting between the lawyer and his sister. "What does that mean?" "It means," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "that 12 hours ago, an anonymous tip was sent to the shadow banking syndicate funding your Chicago tower. The tip included the public filings of your default in Seattle. New York lenders do not like it when their highly leveraged partners secretly default on multi-million-dollar commercial loans. David let out a guttural sound, something between a sob and a gasp. Your mezzanine lenders triggered their own cross-default clauses this morning, Gable confirmed, checking his gold wristwatch. They have frozen Meridian Equities operating accounts and have petitioned a federal judge in Illinois to appoint a receiver to take over the Wacker Drive project. By the time your flight lands at O'Hare tonight, the SEC will likely be auditing your servers. You killed me, David wept, burying his face in his hands. You completely destroyed me. No, David, Sarah said, walking toward the heavy oak doors. I just stopped protecting you from yourself. Goodbye. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within 72 hours, Meridian Equity Partners collapsed under the weight of its own leveraged debt and the sudden withdrawal of its primary backers. David's luxury penthouse in Chicago was seized, his assets frozen, and his wealthy friends, the ones who had drunk his expensive scotch and praised his financial genius, abandoned him entirely. He was left with a mountain of legal fees, facing multiple indictments for wire fraud and deceptive financial practices. He had to rely on a public defender. Sarah, meanwhile, returned to the Queen Anne Hill. She walked up the slate pathway of her childhood home, the brass key to the newly changed locks heavy in her hand. The luxury real estate broker David had hired had staged the house to look like a sterile, modern art gallery, stripping it of its warmth and history. Over the next month, Sarah methodically brought it back to life. She used the remaining capital in the Aegis Trust to repurchase many of the antiques David had hastily sold off. She reopened Thomas Jenkins's restoration shop in Pioneer Square. She didn't run the daily operations. She hired a talented young restorer from the local guild to manage the floor, but she spent her afternoons there, sitting at her father's old workbench, surrounded by the smell of beeswax and cedar. She had kept exactly one item from the vault for herself, a single, raw, Liberty Head gold coin. She had it set into a simple bezel and wore it on a long chain around her neck, tucked beneath her shirt. It was a cold, heavy reminder against her skin of where she had been and what she was capable of. In the end, the cold concrete of Unit 408 was not Sarah's tomb, but her crucible. The $8 million in untraceable bearer bonds and rare, undocumented, antique coins she found behind that steel vault door provided the leverage she needed. David, blinded by his own hubris, never saw the legal ambush coming. Through carefully orchestrated anonymous buyouts via offshore LLCs, Sarah legally purchased the Queen Anne home and the Pioneer Square shop right out from under her brother, leaving him financially over-leveraged and completely bewildered. Standing in her father's restored antique shop years later, surrounded by the smell of lilies and old wood, Sarah finally understood her father's final lesson. True power isn't handed to you in a lawyer's office. It is forged in the dark, built on patience, and protected by the secrets only a survivor knows how to keep.